For 3 minutes.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, today during this debate, you may hear that some of the reforms that are within H.R. 1960 do not go far enough. The commanders absolutely have to be taken out of the decision process in sex-related offenses. Well, I disagree, Mr. Speaker, and let me tell you why. Holding commanders responsible and accountable for their actions and decisions is the most effective way to change the military culture, especially with regard to sex-related events. Proposals to take the commander out of the military justice decision process, they believe that it will improve those prosecutions. I disagree. They believe it will improve convictions and overall confidence of victims in the military justice system. There is no evidence to support these assertions. In fact, in 2005, the HASC heard similar assertions about the need to conform to UCMJ section on rape and sexual assault to the federal law on those offenses. Congress made that revolutionary change and found that it did not make things better. In fact, the change made things worse. Cases were thrown out. The Court of Military Appeals declared parts of the changes were unconstitutional. Justice for victims was delayed and ignored completely in some instances. Congress had to rewrite the UCMJ to fix the harm done. The lesson from that is to slow down when you're making major changes to UCMJ to make sure that you're doing the right thing. H.R. 1960 does exactly that. It asks both the Secretary of Defense and the independent panel established in fiscal year 13, NDAA, to closely examine the role of the commanders in the UCMJ and to make recommendations for change if appropriate. It's time that we focus on what's best for our victims of sexual assault in the military and how to bring those perpetrators to justice. Let me talk a little bit about some of the reforms that are included in the bill, because there are so many of them that, on a bipartisan basis, that were added to the bill that are going to help reduce the incidences of sexual assault in our military. One of them is that it would strip the commanders of their authority to dismiss a finding by a court-martial. It would limit commanders' ability to reduce, suspend, or dismiss a sentence. It would also establish minimum sentencing guidelines, dismissal or dishonorable discharge for sex-related offenses. Currently, such guidelines only exist in the military for the crimes of murder and espionage. Now it would include those that have to do with sexual assault in the military. There are whistleblower protections that were put in here, advocated by members of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, that would add rape, sexual assault, or other sexual misconduct to the protected communications of service members with a member of Congress or an inspector general. I want to talk about some provisions that I championed that were included in this bill. One of them, that it would review the practices by military criminal investigative organizations in sex-related crimes. It would put forward standardized training procedures that every branch of the military would have to adhere to. It would make our commanders much more accountable throughout that process. The last one that I'll mention today, Mr. Speaker, is a development of a uniform criteria for selection of sexual assault response coordinators.
I yield an additional 30 seconds to the gentlelady.
Mr. Speaker, in the past, yes, absolutely, justice has been delayed, and we have not seen the answers for our victims that they need that have been victims of sexual assault in our military. I wasn't here to work on the other NDAA bills. I wasn't here to have the debate during those conversations that were had in the past. A lot of the things that were done and discussed were empty words and broken promises. Today I'm here to say that these reforms that are included in H.R. 1960 will help our victims and will stop sexual assault in the military today. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege now to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, the Democratic whip, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 3 minutes.
Consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in opposition to this rule, as it fails to make in order several important amendments, including ones from Representatives Speer and Gabbard, that would have continued a critical debate on the urgent problem of sexual assault in the military. The previous speaker has pointed out how important an issue this is. If it's such an important issue, it really deserved broader debate in this House fully. Unfortunately, the Rules Committee saw fit not to allow those amendments in order. But I want to thank the Rules Committee for making in order the amendment by the ranking member, Mr. Smith, to close the detention facility in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I've been to Guantanamo. I don't know how many of my colleagues have been there, but I've been to Guantanamo. And Guantanamo is a significant drain on the Department of Defense's resources. There are other reasons to close Guantanamo, which I will speak of, but the numbers speak for themselves. It cost us $1.6 million per detainee. That's versus $34,000 for federal prisoners. $1.6 million per detainee. $247 million authorized in this bill to replace temporary facilities at Guantanamo. Overall, $264 million a year to keep this facility operational for 166 people. For every dollar spent on a detainee, we spend one less dollar on our troops in the field. At a time of great fiscal uncertainty, it is astounding that this facility stays open. Guantanamo costs us not only in economic might, but in moral might as well. We are a nation of laws, and it is our continued adherence to the Founders' vision of a lawful society that allows us to lead the world in confronting threats to peace and stability. I urge all of my colleagues to think about the damage Guantanamo's continued operation causes to our national security. As our moral might slips, as terrorists continue to use Guantanamo as a recruitment tool, and as our allies grow leery of cooperating with us for fear that a transferred detainee could end up at Guantanamo. I also urge all of us to remember that hundreds of terrorists, hundreds, have faced justice in civilian courts and are currently serving time in prison in the United States. Among them are Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, Richard Reed, the shoe bomber Zacarias Moussaoui, who conspired to kill nearly 3,000 innocent Americans on 9/11, all of them in our prisons here. We don't have to worry about these individuals because our system works. Not a single terrorist, not one, or anyone else has ever escaped from one of our maximum security prisons. Not one. May I have an additional minute? Since 9/11, 494 terrorists have been convicted in our civilian court system. In stark contrast, there have been only 7 terrorists convicted by the military commissions at Guantanamo. 5 of these, by the way, were pleas. To quote General Colin Powell from 2010, quote, "We have 300 terrorists, it's now less, who have been put in jail not by a military commission, but by a regular court system. We ought to remove this incentive that exists in the presence of Guantanamo to encourage people and give radicals an opportunity to say, you see, this is what America is all about." That's Colin Powell. We should be proud of our nation's long history of bringing to justice those who commit crimes that threaten the peace and freedom of innocent people around the world. Guantanamo is a stain on that record. It should be closed. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Additionally, let me say there are a few other amendments that I hope members will support. One is an amendment from my friend Jim McGovern. 30 additional seconds from my friend Jim McGovern. Right. His amendment says that it's a sense of Congress that this body should have the right, indeed the duty, to engage in a debate about the continued path forward in Afghanistan. I urge my colleagues to support that amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Indiana, Mrs. Worlarski.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak in support of this rule. Being new to the House committee, I was very encouraged to see the committee, to see the bipartisan fashion in which this bill was crafted. We worked together as a committee. We had vigorous debates on these issues in the committee. I even had the privilege to work with colleagues across the aisle to address the issue of sexual assault language. I want to thank Chairman McKeon, Ranking Member Smith, for making efforts to combat sexual assault as a cornerstone of this bill. Within this bill are provisions that would strip commanders of their authority to dismiss findings. My bipartisan provision adds rape, sexual assault, or other sexual misconduct to the protected communications of service members with a member of Congress or an Inspector General. This bill also establishes minimum sentencing guidelines, establishes an independent panel to examine the role of the commander in sex-related offenses. It also reviews the practices of military criminal investigative organizations in sex-related crimes. Mr. Speaker, we spent months debating and drafting all of the reforms in this bill I just mentioned. There are a lot of good things in the overall bill. The time for Congress to eradicate sexual abuse in the military is now. And I urge my colleagues to support the rule so that we can move these much-needed reforms one step closer to becoming law. And thank you. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Lady yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1½ minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
I thank my good friend, and I thank the manager of the legislation and the underlying legislation in this rule. Happy Father's Day to all of the men who serve in the United States military, for this legislation points in some instances to the needs of these great servants and to the women who serve in the United States military as well. I, too, would have wanted to see the Spears and Gabbard Amendment be included. I am glad that an amendment I submitted to post sexual assault prevention information and to be able to ensure that there are ways of getting resources to those victims of which we want to see diminished. I also am glad to note Mr. McGovern's amendment has been put in, and another amendment by Mr. Conyers that has to do with not using force in Iran. But also we recognize that our soldiers suffer from PTSD, and I'm glad that an amendment has been made to extend the mental health services and counselors for our soldiers. But one that I've been working on for a long time has come to fruition, and I want to thank the Rules Committee and, of course, the Armed Services Committee, and that is to collaborate between the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense on finding the biomarkers on triple-negative breast cancer. It will save lives of so many women. I do and had hoped that we could have moved the 1.8% salary increase to 2.2%. I know that it costs money. Yes, it does, but our soldiers are valuable. Finally, I wish we could have had a thoughtful discussion to restore the trust to Americans around our civil liberties and the expanse that we've had, to simply strain in the number of private contractors that deal with intelligence gathering. I intend to introduce legislation. I thank the Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a significant problem of sexual assaults in the military, and this bill addresses many of the issues that we know legislatively will help both change the culture and change the environment in the military. Recent surveys indicate that over 28,000 people have indicated that they have been sexually assaulted in the military, but slightly less than 3,000 are willing to come forward and actually ask that their perpetrator be prosecuted. When you look at that number further, the survey indicates that 62% of those who came forward indicated that they felt that they were persecuted in the workplace for having done so. Many victims of sexual assault in the military report that they have been re-victimized, that they in fact fear the system, and that there is a sense that if one reports a sexual assault, that it will negatively impact their career and perhaps even put them at risk for further violence. What we've tried to do in this bill on a bipartisan basis, working with Nikki Tsongas, my co-chair of the Sexual Assault Prevention Caucus, and working with Chairman McKeon and Ranking Member Smith, is to look at ways in which the commander's role can be restricted and to require that decision-making on sexual assaults be pushed up the chain of command and instill upon the entire system an evaluation process so that those that are making decisions are held accountable for those decisions. We have taken away from the commander the ability to set aside a conviction for sexual assault, and we've added mandatory minimums so that if you commit a sexual assault, you are out of the military. If there is an inappropriate relationship between a trainee and a trainer, you are out of the military. We have tried to make certain in this that we had bipartisan consensus. Now, there are those who say that we need a whole new judicial system in order to be able to address sexual assault, but in fact the judicial system hasn't been the failure. The chain of command has been the failure, and we have addressed that by restricting the authority of the chain of command, by requiring decisions be pushed up the chain of command, and by imposing a system and a criteria of holding them accountable. I also want to thank the Rules Committee for supporting the Turner Amendment. Thank you.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. And I want to follow up on the previous comments. A strong case was made for changing the way in which rape is handled and sexual assaults handled, but it doesn't go far enough, and unfortunately the rule doesn't allow for a full discussion and a full vote by the House on this very, very important issue being brought to us by my colleague from California, Ms. Spear. We need to have that debate here. We need to really go outside the chain of command for the most important piece, and that is the charging of the incident. Beyond that, the Rules Committee did pick up an issue that I put forward. The Afghanistan National Army is going to receive $7.7 billion in this legislation. Unfortunately, $2.6 billion has been added to last year's money, and there's no indication of how that $2.6 billion will be spent. So the Rules Committee did adopt my amendment. It will be en bloc, and that deals with can't spend that money until we find out how it's going to be spent, basic policy that we apply to every military acquisition in our own military. East Coast Missile Defense Site remains not to be debated on the floor. That's unfortunate. $2.25 billion this year, $2.25 million this year, and more in the future. Language in this bill about Syria ought to be debated on the floor. Fortunately, it will, and we're going to also debate the authorization to use force. We need that debate. Unfortunately, in the committee markup, only moments were spent on the Afghanistan war. More than $80 billion will be spent there. At a time when we are reducing our forces by 40%, we're actually spending at least as much as we're spending in the current year. Why? We need to ask that question. Why are we spending that amount of money as we reduce our forces? It was not discussed at all during the markup. We need that full debate on the floor, and therefore, for these reasons, I oppose the rule. We must debate this $700 billion bill in full. Thank you.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, my colleague on both the Rules Committee and the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the gentleman from Florida yielding. I now owe you one more. This is an impeccably good rule. It made in order 172 amendments, which makes someone wonder why we have committees in the first place. I wish to illustrate or bring to light 3 of those particular amendments so they're not overlooked in the rhetoric that we have going here today, because each does have an impact on the readiness taking place. The first one is one by a gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Pierce, which would ask the agencies of this government to communicate with the military when something actually would impact the military. In this case, BLM making a decision which would have a great deal of impact on our military lands in New Mexico. We saw this earlier when NASA decided to change its flight program. It had a great deal of impact on the cost of our missile defense system. And when the FAA decided to close towers, which impacted 3 military bases and made their security much more tenuous, and all these cases without ever discussing the impact of those decisions with the military. We have an administration that seems to have the problem of interagency communication when the actions of one impact the actions of the other, and this is the first step to move it that way. Ms. Lemus of Wyoming has an amendment which would create a warm line for the ICBM. Not only would this increase our security, but it ensures we have an adequate industrial base. We cannot turn on and off our base like a spigot when we need them, our industrial base. When we need them, they're there, and when we don't need them, they can go off. This would require us to have a strong industrial base and would move us forward in the area of security. Finally, I wish to address an amendment by Mr. Riggle of Virginia. It deals with A76. On the surface, this looks like a wonderful idea. Who can be opposed to competition, especially when it's fair and apples to apples? Unfortunately, this particular amendment is comparing artichokes to avocados, which have only the fact they start with the letter A in common and the fact that I hate both of them equally. 5 years ago, the Office of Management and Budget asked the General Accounting Office to review A76, as well as the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. They concluded that this program should be suspended because there were structural flaws within this system that was dealt with on its implementation. None of those suggested structural flaws have been fixed in the meantime. This system has been studied and found wanting. At the same time, the administration or the Department of Defense has come up with a DTM process, which is required to be reviewed by the underlying base bill. Now is not the time to change that process of A76 until that review has also been completed. Let me be kind of honest here. The idea before A76 is really about lowest price, but not necessarily best value. If it was lowest price, you're doing a product that you're going to put on the open market that can either sell or not sell, who really cares what happens to it? But when you're dealing with the military, you're dealing with military equipment that must be repaired on a timely basis and be available on a timely basis, or lives are lost. And that becomes the significance of this particular issue. What we should be doing, instead of trying to go backwards to A76, is do a public-private partnership, which many of our depots are actually doing. In that case, I am appreciative that Mr. Ridgell did put one sentence that would not interfere with any public-private partnerships that we are doing at the present time. But the idea of allowing the creativity of the private sector to meet with the stability of a workforce from a public sector would be the ideal solution, rather than trying to do some other program which would create a food fight, which would be costly, counterproductive, harm our readiness, and destroy the morale of our workforce, which is already harmed because of the furloughs they are facing. In this particular amendment, the Office of Management and Budget is opposed to it. The Department of Defense is opposed to this amendment, and so should we on the floor of the House. With that, I yield back.
Time's expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to yield 1½ minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you to my friend, Mr. McGovern, for yielding. I rise to speak today on sexual assault in the military and the need for justice and reform. This issue carries great significance for me as I represent the area around Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. The community in San Antonio, like communities across the country, was appalled to learn of the events that took place at Lackland. The sexual misconduct by military training instructors at Lackland has been one of the largest sexual misconduct scandals and investigations within the military. Similar stories have also surfaced from the academies to forward operating bases and now in the Pentagon. When events like this occur, we must do two things. First, we must provide justice swiftly, and second, we must implement reforms to prevent future transgressions. I'll continue to work with the committee to make sure that the recommendations for reform are implemented and serve as a model for the other branches of service. This legislation does make progress in combating military sexual assault, but let us not forget that there is still much work to be done. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in support of this very fair rule, which has allowed 172 amendments. And I rise in strong support of the amendment by the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, which would accelerate the pace of withdrawal from Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, the American people do not want forever wars that now have lasted longer than 3 or 4 times longer than World War II. Afghanistan has simply become little more than a gigantic money pit, with President Karzai and his cronies ripping off American taxpayers for billions of dollars. President Karzai has made it very clear that even he wants us out, but of course he still wants us to send in our billions. It is long past the time. In fact, Mr. Speaker, there never should have been a time in the first place for needless wars that keep resulting in the killing and maiming of young American soldiers. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have always been more about money and power than about any real threat to the American people. William F. Buckley changed his views before he died and came out strongly against the war in Iraq. What he said in 2005 regarding the war in Iraq can be said about Afghanistan today. Mr. Buckley said, quote, "A respect for the power of the United States is engendered by our success in engagements in which we take part. A point is reached when tenacity conveys not steadfastness of purpose, but misapplication of pride." Mr. Speaker, as other speakers have pointed out before me, this bill, the underlying bill, calls for a spending of $85 billion or $7 billion a month for the war in Afghanistan. That is too much. It is time to bring our troops home.
Massachusetts recognized.
Thank you.
Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Lowenthal.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. I'm here today. I stand in support of the Smith Amendment to close the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay has become a symbol around the world for an America that's lost sight of its own cherished principles: due process, habeas corpus, the rule of law. I recently visited Guantanamo Bay detention camp. Seeing this camp made it clear to me that we cannot keep these detainees forever without charging them with crimes and giving them their day in court. It is not humane, it is not just, it is not American. Some prisoners must go home, some must face trial, some prisoners will spend the rest of their lives in jail. In the end, though, we must close this chapter and ensure that justice is done. Guantanamo must close. Keeping Guantanamo camp open only is a complete waste of taxpayers' money. The solution is to support Congressman Smith's amendment to close Guantanamo Detention Center. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the gentleman formerly from the great state of Illinois. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the rule, and I appreciate the time to talk about a very critical issue that the underlying bill addresses. As the father of a 16-year-old daughter, I don't know how comfortable I would be if she came to me and said she would like to join the military, especially given the current culture regarding sexual assault. This year alone, 26,000 men and women in the military have been impacted by sexual assault. The National Defense Authorization Act is a step in the right direction in ending this culture and ending this intolerance, as it includes mandatory sentencing requirements and strips commanders of their authority to dismiss a conviction by court-martial. The Department of Defense estimates that there were 19,000 victims of sexual assault in FY 2011 alone, but only 2,700 victims actually filed a report. In early May, I was pleased to co-sponsor H.R. 1864, a military whistleblower bill which extends whistleblower protections to those that report instances of sexual misconduct. This valuable provision has been added to the National Defense Authorization Act. I am pleased to see Congress respond to the issues of sexual assault within the military, and I look forward to the day when all fathers will be comfortable sending daughters like mine into the military to fight for our freedoms and without second thoughts about their safety. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Gentlewoman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to the rule. I thank Mr. McGovern for yielding. Last week, this House passed the Ruth Moore Act to help support the victims of sexual assault and trauma in the military. But more must still be done to stop these crimes before they occur. I thank the Armed Services Committee members for their work on this issue to date, but unfortunately, the Sexual Assault Training, Oversight, and Prevention Amendment, sponsored by Representative Jackie Speier, was not made in order. This amendment would help stop sexual violence in our military and remove sexual predators from its ranks, and we should have a chance to vote up or down on the provision. We're missing a crucial opportunity to stop the unwanted sexual contact that is now experienced by 1 in 5 servicewomen. I've heard from Oregonians who live with the painful memory of sexual assault they experienced while serving, and veterans associations concerned for the safety of those who answer the call of duty. We all agree that these crimes have no place in our society and no place in our military. It's too bad that we were deprived of an opportunity to do something meaningful about it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I reserved balance.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for allowing me to speak. My colleagues have all spoken eloquently on the floor today about the importance of addressing this issue of sexual assault and rape in the military. And what we hasten to do around here is pat ourselves on the back for all the things we have done. But let me tell you what the elephant in the room is here today. The elephant in the room here today is we have not had a robust debate on chain of command. And why is my good friends on the Republican side of the aisle unwilling to have that debate? Let's just air it. The Senate has taken up this issue in their committee. They've had a full-out hearing on it, and yet we have not done that in the House and the Armed Services Committee. I had an amendment that was taken up last night by the Rules Committee. It had 134 co-sponsors. It was bipartisan in nature. What's wrong with taking up an amendment with over a quarter of the membership of this House on the floor in what is supposed to be an open debate on this issue? We will not fix this issue, members, if we don't fix it on the front end. And the problem is on the front end, where people feel that they cannot file their complaint for fear of retaliation, and when complaints are filed, and there were 3,300 of them filed in the last in 2011, only 500 of them were investigated and sent to court-martial, and less than 200 actually had convictions. So why would anyone who is raped or sexually assaulted in the military feel with confidence that they will receive justice? We deserved an opportunity to have a robust debate on the chain of command and whether or not we should take these cases out of the chain of command. Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, all have taken these cases out of the chain of command. At the very least, we should be able to debate it. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are two things that I think are important to note about the Spear Amendment. The first is that the author of the amendment is actually a full member of the Armed Services Committee and chose not to offer this amendment in the Armed Services Committee, where there could have been unlimited debate on the substance of the amendment, instead choosing to offer it in this more limited format, where there were hundreds of amendments and certainly limited time and issues of great import. Also, it's cast in the light of the fact that you have a bipartisan full support for the provisions that are in our bill that do address sexual assault. And the second thing that's important about the Spear Amendment is that, as the author noted, there had been debate on this in the Senate, and in that debate, in fact, it was rejected, the structure that was being proposed in the Spear Amendment. So we already have the Senate's view, and we also have a bipartisan view of this House on what needs to be done, and that is this, and we share with the author the absolute commitment that this needs to be addressed. The manner in which we've done it, again on a bipartisan basis, is by moving it up the chain of command and restricting the chain of command. No more can a commander, by their signature, set aside a conviction for sexual assault. No more can someone who's convicted of a sexual assault stay in the military. We will never have another victim who has to report that after a conviction of a perpetrator for sexual assault that they were forced to salute their attacker. That attacker will be out. Now, there is more that we can do. In fact, I want to thank the Rules Committee for having ruled in order my amendment, the Turner Amendment, that would also include 2 years of incarceration along with the mandatory minimum of being thrown out. I would encourage everyone to support the Turner Amendment who actually would like to increase the penalties beyond what we've done. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Speaker, happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. O'Rourke.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding time. I rise today in support of the McGovern, Smith, Lee, Jones, Garamendi amendment to responsibly end the war in Afghanistan. I have the distinct honor of representing Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, home to 33,000 active-duty Army service members and their families. Since the start of this war in Afghanistan, 41 soldiers from Fort Bliss have lost their lives in combat. In April of this year, 5 Fort Bliss soldiers lost their lives in a single IED attack. All 5 of them had already been awarded both a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. Just this last month, 3 Fort Bliss soldiers were killed in a single attack. More than 100 have been injured in combat and awarded the Purple Heart. Countless soldiers are coming back to our community with unseen mental injuries, including post-traumatic stress disorder. And already this year, 3 soldiers at Fort Bliss have committed suicide. This terrible loss of life should focus us on our solemn responsibility to know when to bring our soldiers home to their families. We are grateful for their service and for their achievements. Because of them, Osama bin Laden has been killed, the Taliban has been weakened, and the Afghan people have been given the opportunity to develop a stable and democratic state if they so choose. I believe now is the right time to responsibly end the longest war in our nation's history. This amendment would help ensure that the President sticks to his timetable to end combat operations by the end of this year and bring our soldiers home from Afghanistan by the end of the next year. This amendment will save lives, and it honors the sacrifice of our soldiers who have lost their lives by guaranteeing that Congress fulfills our constitutional responsibility to decide when to send our soldiers into harm's way and how long to keep them there. I urge all of my colleagues to support it and bring our soldiers back home. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Veazey.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud today to stand with my colleagues, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard and Dr. Benishik, in support of their amendment to include the Military Justice Improvement Act of 2013 in the National Defense Authorization Act, and I regret that this rule for this bill did not allow it. The Military Justice Improvement Act will reform the military legal procedure for handling sexual assault cases by giving a military attorney outside the victim's chain of command the ability to initiate legal proceedings. This is a fundamental change from currently requiring a sexual assault victim to first turn to their commanding officer to investigate and decide how to advance the case. As a member of the House Armed Services Committee, I am proud to support this bill that will decrease the occurrence of sexual assault within our military ranks. The current state of 26,000 reported sexual assault incidents in 2012 is completely unacceptable. This amendment will strengthen initiatives already in the defense bill that aim to reduce this way too high number. Our military men and women deserve better, and this bill is a strong step in the right direction. And also, Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition of the amendment by Mr. Kaufman that would direct the Defense Department to contract any function not considered to be inherently governmental with no regard to policy, risk, or costs. At a time when service and contract costs to our military have risen by 200% in the last 10 years and civilian personnel costs have remained relatively flat, I believe it's irresponsible to require our military to outsource important governmental work like developing budgets, overseeing contracts, and interpreting regulations to private contractors. We cannot allow our federal employees and civilian personnel to continue to serve at the first line of cuts and furloughs in an effort to cut costs. Federal employees and civilian personnel are a critical component to our national security and consistently deliver their services at significantly lower costs than private contractors. In fiscal year 2010, the Pentagon reported saving nearly $900 million by using civilian workers instead of private contractors. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment and let the defense workers continue their service. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, yesterday I joined with many of my colleagues here on the floor to urge the Congress and the Rules Committee to take seriously the disturbing high incidence of sexual assault in the military and to act quickly and responsibly to address the issue. Yesterday on this floor we were promised full consideration and open debate on an issue that affects at a minimum 26,000 individuals in the United States Armed Services. And yet here we are today with a closed rule, consideration of only some amendments, and frankly the amendments that would actually do the most to strengthen the hand of survivors and prosecutors aren't being considered on this floor. And that's really unfortunate. I feel that we have let 26,000 victims of sexual assault down. We've just let them down. And for all the good intentions, and I think that there were good intentions, the Congress has considered for the last 20 years testimony and information from the Department of Defense on its efforts to eliminate sexual assault from its ranks. And these well-intentioned efforts are falling well short, and we know that. But we can't wake up on another day or in another 20 years to say, you know what, we still have to solve the problem. And so I would urge us, we have to do that today for those victims. And with the estimated 26,000, that's up even 19,000 from 2011, we know that something is not working. And while some of the provisions that are being considered today are good faith efforts, the dozens, including the Spear Amendment, supported by experts, advocates, and legal experts, and proposed before the Rules Committee to take additional steps to show that we really do mean business, are not being considered. It's really unfortunate that only half of those amendments were made in order. And with an issue as pervasive and damaging as this, where Republicans and Democrats, men and women, agree that we have to do something, why for those 26,000 victims aren't we doing everything that we can? We can't stand on the side of the perpetrators. We must stand on the side of victims and survivors. And with that, I yield.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 1/2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Maine, Ms. Pingree.
Gentlewoman from Maine is recognized.
Thank you to my good friend for yielding, Mr. Speaker. As we confront the issue of sexual assault in the military, we can't forget the survivors who continue to serve. One area that has needed reform is the questionnaire that must be filled out to obtain or renew a security clearance. One of the questions, question 21, asks if you have ever sought mental health counseling. Knowing the question is there and believing that answering yes might jeopardize their chances at a security clearance, survivors of sexual assault often decided not to get the mental health counseling that they needed. The Director of National Intelligence has listened to us on this and has issued guidance saying survivors of sexual trauma do not have to report counseling related to that assault. But that change won't do the survivors any good unless they know it has taken place, which is why I've introduced an amendment that is part of a package we are considering later today that would require the Department of Defense to inform service members of this change. Mr. Speaker, I regularly hear from survivors of sexual assault who want to know when the change will be made. It's time they get their answer. It's unfortunate that this rule does not allow more time for debate on these critical topics, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 1/2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the gentleman for yielding, for your support, and for your tremendous leadership on so many issues. Let me rise, first of all, in strong opposition to this rule. I am extremely disappointed that Congress was denied the opportunity on this floor to have a full and necessary debate about our constitutional role in declaring war and our obligation to conduct vigorous oversight, accountability, and to demand transparency. While I appreciate the committee making my bipartisan amendment with Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton with regard to HIV discrimination in order, I offered a number of other amendments to audit the Pentagon and to end the overly broad 2001 authorization to use military force, which is a blank check. I have long called for repeal of this authorization, dating back to the horrific days of 9/11, right when we debated that resolution for no more than an hour on September 14th. We did not have a meaningful debate 12 years ago, and by blocking my amendment, this Congress will not be able to exercise its constitutional war-making duties today. Let me also say that I am pleased to join Representatives McGovern, Jones, Garamendi, and our Armed Services Ranking Member Adam Smith on an amendment which was made in order, which will at least give us an opportunity to open that door and begin to talk about the fact that it is time to bring our troops home, and that once 2014 is here, then we need to determine what Congress will authorize, if anything. Also, let me just say, it's important that, may I have an additional 10 seconds, please?
I yield an additional 10 seconds.
Thank you very much. The amendment that was made in order, Congressman Hank Johnson and myself, with regard to prohibiting permanent military bases, so important. So finally, let me just say, Congress must debate and authorize any future troop presence in Afghanistan beyond 2014. Thank you for yielding.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how much time is remaining?
Gentleman has 2¼ minutes.
Okay. Then I'm happy to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Sinema.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very disappointed that the Rules Committee chose to disallow my amendment from being heard today. The amendment that I offered in conjunction with Representative Benishek and Representative Gabbard simply allowed for victims of sexual violence in the military to have an opportunity to seek justice in court in the light of day without fear of retribution or recrimination from their superiors. This amendment, Mr. Speaker and members, would have taken the policy outside of the chain of command so that victims of sexual assault would have the opportunity to seek justice, and that those perpetrators who have committed sexual assault against their fellow service members would be held accountable for the acts for which they have committed. In this instance, Mr. Speaker and members, this amendment would ensure that the victims could report the crimes, seek justice without fear of retribution, or even worse, having a superior who ignores or downplays the severity of the incident which has occurred. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time. Thank you.
Recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire from my friend how many more speakers he has on his side?
I have none.
Okay, then I will yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to urge that we defeat the previous question. And if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to make this an open rule so that members have the opportunity to offer any amendment allowed under the rules of the House. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the amendment in the record along with extraneous materials immediately prior to the vote on the previous question. Mr. Speaker, let me just say that I think the Rules Committee had a difficult task, given the fact that the leadership of this House has kind of only allocated 2 days for debate on the defense authorization bill. They took they had to deal with 300 amendments, and they made 172 in order. And I know that everybody worked hard to try to be fair. I appreciate again the courtesy extended to me on my amendment with regard to Afghanistan. I appreciate my colleagues on the Republican side for their support. I think the controversy still is around the issue of sexual assault in the military, and a number of amendments, particularly those offered by Ms. Spear and Ms. Gabbard, were not made in order. That, unfortunately, makes it very difficult for many on our side to support this rule. But I want to thank again the staff of the Rules Committee and the members for their work on this. I urge a no vote on the previous question and a no vote on the rule, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is my third National Defense Authorization Act as a member of Congress, and it's my first NDAA as a member of the Armed Services Committee. Let me tell you, it's been an experience. It's been educational, time-consuming, and sometimes exhausting experience, but it's always been a gratifying one. As a father of 3 sons that are currently serving in the United States Army, I never forget the overreaching purpose for all of our work in the Defense Authorization Act. I know that my House colleagues never forget it either. You know, I've had sons that have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, sometimes simultaneously. I know what it's like to send a son or daughter off to war. It's a family, it's something that you anguish over all the time. It's not something that should be done lightly. So I appreciate the McGovern amendment because it's going to have the opportunity to actually discuss and put on the floor an ability for this House to actually authorize or continue authorization of any force. And I think this House has been, unfortunately, somewhat derelict in its duties because of what we've done in the past and what we've called the President to do when we went into Libya, even though limited by air support only. We should never put our men and women at risk unless this House has a say in that is so precious to us, and that's our sons and daughters. You heard Mr. Turner speak as it relates to sexual assault. I've heard a lot on the floor about Mrs. Spears. She had the ability in the Armed Services Committee, the committee I serve on, she had the ability to bring that up in committee and have unlimited debate within that body in regards to her amendment. She chose not to do that. Instead, she chose to bring it in front of the Rules Committee that has a limited time slot. Of the 299 amendments that were brought forward, 172 were made in order that are going to be heard on this floor today. That's what this rule is about giving everybody access and to be heard on all the important aspects of the NDA. So to say that she was locked out just isn't so. The ability was there. As a member of the House Committee, she had the ability to have unlimited debate. Remember, the NDA passed out of that committee 59-2. That's about as bipartisan as you can get, and it really talks about the issues that are important to America, and particularly as it relates to protecting our sons and daughters that are called upon to protect this nation, called upon to go out and sacrifice for this nation. We owe them that much. We want to make sure that they're successful at any mission that they're sent forward to participate in to protect the interests of this nation and our allies. You know, the American people hear about, in the news media, about how partisan Congress is today. Although we have our disagreements, and I know those reports and folks back home can't be looking at the work we're doing on the Armed Services Committee if they see is partisanship, because it's not there. If they were looking at the Armed Services Committee this year in the National Defense Authorization Act, they'd see the kind of collaboration that legislating is supposed to be about. They'd see a chairman and a ranking member who work together on a common goal. They'd see staff that works to benefit our warfighters and not a political party. They'd see an NDA that was passed with out of the largest committee, the House of Representatives, with only 2 people opposing it. And tomorrow I hope they'll see a House of Representatives that can put politics aside and support our troops by overwhelmingly passing the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2014. It's a good bill. HRES 260 makes it even better by allowing the House to consider amendments covering all the major issues covered by NDA and Department of Defense at large. I always like to say that nobody has a monopoly on good ideas, and that truism is evidenced by the 299 amendments that were offered with this legislation. The rule provides time for a vote on a majority of those ideas. That's why I support the rule, I support the underlying legislation, and I hope the House as a whole can do the same. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker,
Massachusetts is recognized.
on that I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the Chair will reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote on the question of adoption of the resolution. This is a 15-minute vote.
A second day of work in the House on the 2014 Defense Authorization Act, which includes $552 billion in spending for defense, an additional $86 billion for the war in Afghanistan and other overseas operations. They did a general debate yesterday. Today, this morning, debating the rule for the rest of the amendments to be considered. 172 amendments allowed under the rule. They'll have the rule vote next. This 15-minute vote is the previous question vote, and the rule vote next. So 172 amendments to be considered if the rule passes. Also on Capitol Hill today, the NSA Director, National Security Agency Director, General Keith Alexander, has been briefing both the House Intelligence Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee on the leak of classified NSA information. Meanwhile, House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi said in her briefing she called for Edward Snowden to be prosecuted for leaking the information about U.S. surveillance programs. He's the former CIA employee who shared that national security information with the Guardian newspaper and other media outlets. The Speaker briefed reporters at the Capitol earlier today. We'll show you as much of her comments as we can during this 15-minute vote.
Good morning. This morning on the floor we were observing that tomorrow marks the 6-month anniversary since the Newtown tragedy. Floor speeches, conference calls, visits from the families, that has been taking up some of our time, all in the hope of bipartisan legislation for gun violence prevention, manifested in legislation for background checks. That's very sad. To some of us, the role of government is about doing things for the American people to help them reach their fulfillment. It's been nearly 6 months, certainly over 5.5, since Congress has been in session for this Congress, and still no jobs bill. I believe we almost have a moral responsibility to have policy which helps to create jobs, whether it's to incentivize the private sector, to make sure that our children are educated, our neighborhoods are safe from crime, and our first responders have the resources they need to protect the American people, to protect and defend. It's our first responsibility, but not one single jobs bill. Nearly 6 months. Now it's over 2 months since we've had the opportunity to go to conference for a budget that would create jobs, which would grow the economy, which would reduce the deficit, and to do so in a timely fashion. Republicans asked for regular order, which means they wanted to go to conference until it was time to go to conference. So I called once again upon my colleagues to allow us to appoint conferees to go to conference again to grow our economy. At the same time now, on this clock that is ticking, in 18 days, interest on student loans will double. It's shameful, putting college out of reach for millions of American families and children. If Republicans had their way, it would even worse than double with the legislation that they passed on the floor. It would more than double. So we, again, have a critical responsibility to keep America competitive. Innovation, education, job creation, keep us number one. And without the investments in education, making it affordable for more families, children cannot reach their fulfillment. America cannot be as preeminent as the vows of our founders would require us to be by creating jobs here in America which contribute to innovation. It's not just in the classroom, it's in job creation in the U.S. that innovation springs from. Again, we have to go to that budget table. Instead, we are in a world of subterfuge, smokescreen, any subject that you want to talk about, just pick one out of the air. And yesterday was really just another day in the life of the Republican Congress. They passed legislation that was disrespectful of the rights, health, and safety of the American women. All the people who voted for the bill were men. disrespectful. Yet another. This is a week. This Monday marked the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy signing the Equal Pay Act. With great enthusiasm, we remembered that day. We used it to recall that 4 years ago, President Obama has signed as his first legislation the Lilly Ledbetter Act to move to end discrimination against women in the workplace. We saluted Rosa DeLauro for a paycheck fairness legislation, a place to take. What man here wouldn't think that his wife, his daughter, his sister, his mother should receive equal pay for equal work in the workplace? Apparently, that does not apply to the Republican Congress. So instead of moving from President Kennedy said a small step to end a shameful and abominable practice of not paying women equally, we still do not have it on the agenda. It passed in the House, as you may know, when we had the majority. The Republicans held it up in the Senate, and so far, not much progress, but we are not going away. So this action yesterday, where the House Judiciary Committee approved the bill without any exceptions in the case of rape, incest, or protecting the health of the women, all the people who voted for the bill were men. Okay, so today on the floor we have the Defense Authorization Bill. 172 amendments are made in order. Only 6 amendments related to sexual assault, but none of them among the more critical and effective measures. They're about curriculum, and it's about this and that, and they're interesting and they're improvements, but they do not get to the heart of the matter. No Jackie Spears amendment, nothing to resemble what is necessary to get to the heart of the matter. How could they not put one of those amendments in order? They instead, good amendments, little tweaks here and there that are important, but nothing essential and crucial to changing what is happening in the military. And Republicans are saying no to members on both sides of the aisle concerned about sexual assault in the military, and on both sides of the aisle ready to vote for amendments to effectively and truly address this challenge. So it's an interesting time. We have a bill on the floor that could make a significant difference of the role of ending sexual assault of men and women in the military. We need a jobs bill. We have a need to do our budget. And yet, what are we doing? Amendments that again, are disrespectful of women. With that, I'll be pleased to take any questions you may.
The bill was passed by the House Judiciary Committee earlier.
Yeah.
Members who have proposed that bill have done that in the wake of this murder trial up in Philadelphia. They argue that there really isn't much of a moral difference between what someone like Dr. Kermit Gosnell did to infants born at 23, 24, 25 weeks into pregnancy, and what can happen at a clinic down the road in Maryland where a doctor says that he'll perform elective abortions 28 weeks into pregnancy. So the question I have for you is, what is the moral difference between what Dr. Gosnell did to a baby born alive at 23 weeks and aborting her moments before birth?
Okay, you're probably enjoying that question a lot. I can see you savoring it. But let me just tell you this. Let me just tell you this. What was done in Philadelphia was reprehensible, and everybody condemned it. For them to decide to disrespect a judgment a woman makes about her reproductive health is reprehensible. Next question. Next question.
You cite Amy, I say that question. What's the moral difference then between 26 weeks, elective abortion, and the killing of that same infant born alive? This is the issue that they're trying to talk about.
This is not the issue. They are saying that there's no abortion. They want to make it a federal law that there be no abortion in our country. You're taking the extreme case. You're taking the extreme case. And what I'm saying to you is what happened in Philadelphia was reprehensible. And I do not think you use that. I'm not going to have this conversation with you because you obviously have an agenda. You're not interested in having an answer. But I have responded to you to the extent that I'm going to respond to you because I want to tell you something. As a mother of 5 children, my oldest child is 6 years old the day I brought my 5th child home from the hospital. As a practicing and respectful Catholic, this is sacred ground to me when we talk about this. I don't think it should have anything to do with politics, and that's where you're taking it, and I'm not going there. Yes, sir.
Next Wednesday, there'll be a dedication, final for a statue
Yes.
in the District of Columbia.
Is that great?
Douglas. How do you view...
I knew that was, what else would bring you to one of our You usually come before Frederick Douglass.
I know. I'll try to make my appearances more varied. But for this, when will the day come? First of all, what does the statue mean? I've read some of the speaker's remarks which say it's a gift from the district. It took a long and tortuous path to actually get the statue placed, but it's only one. When will the day come when there will be two statues? And then when will there be the day where there will actually be not a lump of bronze, but actually a vote in the House?
I guess that depends on your effective activism, because so far you've made great progress. You've increased from nothing to something. We're very excited about Frederick Douglass's statue being unveiled in the Capitol. What you're saying is you want the District of Columbia to have the same right as every state, and I completely and entirely agree with you on that score. I think that if I were orchestrating it, and as you know, our member of Congress, Eleanor Holmes Norton, has been relentless and persistent. And from her committee that she serves on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, which has the jurisdiction over these public buildings and that, she has been an effective advocate, and that's why we have the statue we have today. I would just keep making suggestions of people to have statues here for. What I am pleased with is that in the past few years, and I take some credit for this, we've had just recently the statue to Rosa Parks, and a beautiful statue of her seated, I love that part, in the Capitol. And one of the first statues, a bust of an African-American woman, Sojourner Truth. I say this because one of the things I want to do when I became Speaker was to expand the diversity of statues that exist in the Capitol. Some we can do. Mostly they depend on the states making the change in a statue that they have here. But thank you for your relentless leadership on the subject, and I look forward to working with you for the next statue of a prominent member of the District of representative of the District of Columbia. But more important than that, now it may not seem more important, but more important to that, we want the representative of the District of Columbia to have a vote in the Congress of the United States. And of course, I myself support statehood. Time does not allow me to go into my history on this subject. My father was the chair of the District of Columbia Appropriations Committee when I was born, and he had been an advocate for home rule and more authority for the District of Columbia. And of course, as time has gone by, we want even much more than that. So I'm with you. I'll be willing to help Eleanor in any way possible, but understand how relentless she has been and effective. Yes, sir.
I believe just a few minutes ago at
the
Robert Mueller hearing for the House Judiciary Committee, he was talking about the PRISM program. Yeah. You were the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee for many years during the time of 9/11, and he indicated had PRISM been in place prior to 9/11, they believed that they could have possibly intercepted one of the hijackers. Do you think that's possible with your understanding of the program and your point on the Intelligence Committee at that point?
Yeah, obviously I have not heard the director's testimony. It's just happened this morning. But certainly it would have improved the chances of doing that. I can't say with certainty that it would have, but it certainly would have improved the chance of, now he may have some specific evidence and connection that he was testifying about that I'm not aware of. But yeah, it did give more opportunity to surveil. I want a woman, yeah.
Lizzie, following up on that, at this point, do you think that Mr. Snowden should be prosecuted for leaking the information about the programs? And do you think that Americans, now that you've had more briefings, the dust has settled a little bit, we've heard testimony from General Alexander on dozens of at least a dozen plots being disrupted because of these programs. Should Americans be supportive of the government basically taking all of their cell phone data and looking at the servers of Internet companies?
Well, first of all, I do think that on 3 scores, that is, leaking the Patriot Act, Section 215, FISA 702, and the President's Classified Cyber Operations Directive on the strength of leaking that, yes, that would be a prosecutable offense, and I think that he should be prosecuted. I think I don't agree with your characterization, and should the American people want all of their cell phone calls and data and all the rest surveilled, because that is not what either of these bills does, not the Patriot Act nor 702. I know this, the FISA Act. I'm going to have for my members, and I'm sure you will see it, a side-by-side of what the law was under President Bush and what the actions were under President Bush, what they had proposed in their Protect America Act, which was not acceptable to us, and what we passed in the FISA Act of 2008. And all of the protections that Jim Cole and others have said were abided by in going to a FISA court were insisted upon by the Democrats in that legislation. So there are many protections for the American people, including strengthening the Privacy and Civil Liberties Board. And I think this is really important because we have to help the balance between liberty and security. And liberty is very important to us, and privacy is essential to our liberty. So this board is very important, and I think we strengthened it in the 2008 bill, but I think obviously there's a need to strengthen it further, A, and B, the congressional oversight has to be increased, and that can only be increased with more information being made available to Congress from whatever administration it is. The thwarting that is, was it the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, that he talked about, certainly I don't know the exact number and I don't know the exact cases he's talking about, but I do know that there was a thwarting of some actions against the U.S. The American people were protected. But there's a lot of misinformation out there on this, and before everybody makes judgments about it, it's important to note what did actually, I mentioned 3 leaks that occurred, but what beyond that? Were there leaks just made to the public, which would be one thing? Is information being exchanged with other governments? I don't know that. People are charging that. I don't know that. A. B, how do we have a system that has so relied on the private sector and on contractors to make our security so vulnerable and so exposed that one person could go out and leak information that could be detrimental to our national security in the manner in which this was done? So again, we have to protect the American people. Laws have been passed to determine how that is done with great protection for civil liberties. And I was getting this ready for my colleagues because they want to know what they knew when. Well, some of them voted for it in 2008. But when the President says everybody knew, well, everybody didn't know all of the particulars. Maybe had were exposed to it. The briefings were held, but everybody didn't have the fullest understanding of what the word surveillance means.
Returning for a second to the abortion issue.
I'm not going to. What else? What do you got? What do you got?
On this idea, Mr. Hoyer said that perhaps it might not be a bad idea for Congress to relook at 215, that section. It seemed after that bipartisan briefing you guys had a few days ago,
right,
that was a general consensus. What do you see as the next steps? I mean, will Congress use their legislative muscle here to possibly change these programs? And some even said declassify them more so the public has more awareness. Would you support that?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about, declassifying. I have always been for much more declassification than we have. I think that keeping so many things classified, for what purpose? Is it in our national security to keep them declassified? Does it just invite more opportunities for people to convey information they shouldn't, and therefore a law is broken when it isn't even information that is that harmful. It's just to declassify. We always used to make a joke up in intelligence that would say, oh, you better read the Washington Post before they stamp it classified this morning, because they classified everything that came past them. And then once that happens, then you can't talk about it. So I thought far too much was classified, and even if it was justified at that moment, then in a short period of time, there should be much more declassification, which President Obama has been doing. Should always be revisiting. Technology demands that we look, what we're talking about now is something that could not have even been imagined a couple of decades ago. It was a big deal for us 20 years ago in intelligence. The biggest secret we had, one of the biggest secrets we had, was that we could detect faxes. Oh, don't let anybody ever know that we could detect faxes. You know, I'm talking internationally now. I'm not talking domestic, no domestic content, but internationally, because if they ever found that, they'd stop using faxes. And that was a big deal. It seems like the Stone Age compared to the volume of metadata that can be used. But I really seriously had some concerns about your characterization of should we be willing to allow them to do this, that, and the other thing. No, and that's not what the collection is about. American people saying they can have access to my records, to my data, to my information. That's not what this is about. Yes, sir.
You spoke before about private contractors
and
sharing
some
of this intelligence with foreign countries. Just to be specific, are you opposed to the volume or the blanket use of private contractors? And would you also be opposed to the government sharing some of this stuff with foreign governments, as has been alleged?
Well, I don't know if you're talking about the U.S. government sharing information with foreign governments in the interest of our mutual national security. I'm not opposed to that. I was saying if anybody acquired this information and made it known, for example, in this case, if they were sharing this information with a foreign government, that would be a wrong thing to do. You know, in terms of saying this is what the U.S.'s capability is, and we want you to see what their capability is. There's a great big, gigantic distinction there between how we have relationships with other countries in terms of sharing intelligence to protect our countries. I think there's a real question about the use of contractors to the extent that they are there without, you know, they work in the private sector, enormous profits to be made. Maybe we should bring some of that more in-house with employees of the federal government, with the oath of office that we take to protect and defend our country, and that seriousness of purpose there. And maybe we need some private. I'm not saying we shouldn't have some private, because that can facilitate our security. But let's take a measure of how much that is. I think that's a worthy question, how much intelligence that is in the hands of private sector. And don't you think that, I mean, of all questions, you know, let's just be completely removed from it. How on earth can we have a situation where we are so vulnerable, so exposed, with so much information about how we acquire intelligence, to the point that the head of the DNI is saying that it seriously hurts our national security? Is that what he said, words to that effect? How could we be satisfied by one person walking out the door with access to so much information? I think that's a question that Congress has to ask, and that we have to make a judgment about. You asked about any laws to be changed about how these things are done. But all of these things, every step of the way, the Patriot Act, of which 215 is a part, we had the sunset of some of the more offensive aspects of the bill. We had and of course they have been extended, but we've had the Privacy and Civil Liberties Board in that bill, much more strengthened. in FISA, if you saw all the routine that people have to go through. And I'll close by saying this. It's very important to note that we have said that FISA is the sole route that an administration can go. They have, I don't have any of that here, but they had wanted, the Bush administration had wanted, and I'm not making this a partisan thing, I'm just saying there was thinking at the time was that we don't need to go to a FISA court. We don't need a court. We can just unilaterally decide that we're going to surveil. And that was the fight that we had in 07 and 08, and that's why the 2008 FISA bill has as many protections built into it as it does. One more. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask about immigration?
Sure.
Because the bipartisan House group is still struggling to unveil any legislation, and some of the Republicans in the group continue to suggest that you're the holdup and that you'd rather have the issue than the accomplishment. And I'm just wondering how you respond to that. And if Boehner decides to move bills in a piecemeal mode, do you think that could essentially end up with the kind of comprehensive package that you would want?
Well, let me say, first of all, that I disagree with the characterization that you put forth. We are working now just on them writing the language, Leg Council, whatever, to put it in legislative language so that with the principles that they agree to, that language, when translated to legislative language, is what everybody understood it to be. As you know, around here, going from principles to language, well, the angel is in the details, and I keep saying that because it's really important for us to have an immigration bill. I think that anybody who would say that I would rather have the issue than the bill just doesn't know what they're talking about. This is something that is so glorious for our country that we will have a bill, that many of us are willing to swallow some things we don't like about the bill, some terrible poison pills, but not deadly, and that will make progress on it. But I don't, you say that some of those Republicans are saying that. Maybe one of them, I don't know, but I think the other ones know that we're moving forward with the legislation, and they've worked very hard in good faith over time, and now they're putting it into language, and even one of the members who's not still a part of the group had an impact on the substance of the bill that is acceptable, is part of what is moving forward. I think it's really important not only for us to have a bill, but the House have a bill. The House have a bill. I wanted us to be first, as a matter of fact, but one thing and another, they couldn't reach agreement, and the Senate has moved ahead, and that's good, too. So we would hope that this bill, because it is a consensus...
And the nays are 195. The previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker?
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
On that, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. 5-minute vote.
It's the rule vote for the Defense Authorization Bill. The rule would allow for 172 amendments to be considered, addressing issues such as the treatment of Guantanamo